Well, good evening, everyone. Happy to be back here in person. So, like I say, Indianapolis is just far enough away. It's doable to come out here, but not every week, maybe. So, just especially with the work schedule. So, we are starting the New Testament this evening. So, I want to go ahead and jump into the first three Gospels: Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And I'd like you to turn to the very end of the book of Acts, which might seem like a curious place to start when we're going to look at the first three Gospels. I have a very particular question to ask you about, which I'm actually kind of half serious. Not totally serious, but I'm sort of half serious in this question I'm going to ask you from the very end of the book of Acts. Last week, I finished by noting that Jesus was crucified in probably the year 30 or maybe the year 33. And the reason it has to be either 30 or 33, it's one of those things where if you're trying to figure out, like, say, a holiday like Christmas, and when Christmas is on a Tuesday, Christmas is on a Tuesday some years, but most years it's not. If you try to work through the crucifixion and when it happened in relation to the Passover or the Sabbath and so on, in that time period, it has to be the 30 or 33. I'm going to say that Jesus was crucified in the year 30 for tonight's class, even though I don't know which one of the two, and that just makes it kind of easy to picture. The Gospels weren't written until like the early to mid-60s, so there's a 30-year gap before anybody writes the Gospels. And I kind of hinted at last week about one of the reasons why is right away, if you think a couple of years after, say, Jesus was crucified and ascended to heaven, all the Christians basically were there in the land of Israel, and a lot of the people had met Jesus, had known Jesus, and even if you weren't one of the people who had heard him in his preaching or seen some of the miracles or something, you probably knew somebody who had been there, so you could go and talk verbally. But 30 or so years down the road, now there's kind of an occasion to get the Gospels written and so on, partly because the Gospels expanded across the Mediterranean, the Roman Empire, and partly just because people are getting older and some of the people who knew Jesus have died and so on by that point. But anyway, so the reason I want to start at the very end of Acts is this. Luke and Acts are a 2-volume set. And a lot of people know that, but don't really use it. And I will say that when Ray asked me to teach the class, I gave him a couple of choices of topics, one of which was Luke and Acts is a 2-volume set, which I love reading them as a 2-volume set because they go together. And if you know that, there are things you can pick up on, especially in Luke, knowing what we know from Acts. I'll give you just a small taste of that in a little bit. But here's my question about which I'm half serious, that kind of is a way to introduce this topic here from the end of Acts 28. Acts 28, Alaric, do you mind reading the last 2 verses of Acts 28, so verses 30 and 31?
Yeah. He lived there 2 whole years at his own expense and welcomed all who came to him, proclaiming the kingdom of God and teaching about the Lord Jesus Christ with all boldness and without hindrance.
Okay, thank you. That's a curious place to end. Because what's he waiting for? He's waiting to have his appeal heard by Caesar, which was Nero Caesar at this point in history. So if you remember back in Acts 21, there had been a riot, he'd been arrested, and he'd ended up over in Caesarea, and had been held for 2 years. And when the new governor comes in, Festus, Paul, for reasons we don't have time to get into, says, I appeal to Caesar. And as a Roman citizen, he had the right. Well, if you appeal to Caesar, which you could do as a Roman citizen back then, that doesn't mean that you're on his calendar as soon as you get yourself over to Rome. You get to get there on Caesar's calendar. And so he gets there, he has the shipwreck, and here at the end of Acts 28, he's in Rome. And it takes 2 years before he gets to meet with Syro-Nizer and have his appeal heard. Here's my half-serious question. Of all the speeches and things that we have in Acts, you think about, we've got Peter's speech on the day of Pentecost in Acts 2, you got Peter in Acts 3 with the lame man, you got Stephen's defense in chapter 7, you got Paul at the city of Antioch in chapter 13, Paul at Athens in Acts chapter 17, his defense before the crowd in 22, the Sanhedrin in 23, Felix in 24, Festus in 25, Agrippa in 26. Where in the world is Acts chapter 29, Paul's defense before Nero? Isn't that the one you almost really want to hear? I'd rather hear what he had to say before. Can you picture what Acts 29 would look like? Okay, so picture Acts 29 if it existed, and I'm not suggesting that it was originally there and somebody cut it out, but picture what Acts 29 would look like. okay, you would have him coming into Caesar's presence, and he'd probably get, cleaned up and dressed up a little bit, and imagine him saying, "Oh, most excellent Nero," and giving this great proclamation about the gospel. So why in the world isn't it in there? And I submit it's because, and look at that verse 30, he stayed 2 full years. Luke knew that it was 2 years. It's almost like he finishes the book on the eve of Paul walking into Nero, which makes sense if, and I want you to think about this for a second, suppose you're on the docket because you appealed to Caesar and you're waiting for 2 years and it's finally your turn. Would you have given some thought to what you're going to say? Absolutely. In being a court case, as it were, might you have some documentation? Absolutely. And if you stop and think about it, it actually makes sense that one of the things that energetic Paul would have done with Luke's help during the 2 years he was in Rome is say, you know what, I used to go out and do all this preaching everywhere, but I spent 2 years in prison in Caesarea, now 2 years here in Rome. I haven't been getting out for 4 years. Things are moving on. It might be worthwhile to have a written record, okay, that serves multiple purposes. So one purpose would be to sort of introduce into the docket system, as it were, so that Nero and some of his underlings, have a chance to look at this stuff. Also to generally preach the gospel, also to deal with some of the problems. If you turn back just a couple of pages, I want you to look at what Paul's strategy was. And it's in Acts chapter 26. And he's talking to King Agrippa and also to the governor Festus, and so on. And Pat, would you mind reading? As Paul is talking towards the end of the chapter, I want you to look at what he says to King Agrippa in verse 27, and then I want you to look at the little back and forth also in 28 and 29. So Acts 26, and Pat, would you read 27 through 29?
Okay. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know that you do. And Agrippa replied to Paul, in a short time you will persuade me to become a Christian. And Paul said, I would to God that whether in a short time or a long time, not only you, but also all who hear me this day might become such as I am, except for these chains.
Okay, and so that was kind of Paul's goal, as it were. He's giving his defense before Festus and Agrippa, but he's actively preaching right in the middle of his defense. And are you trying to convert me? Yeah. Okay, so I think that Luke and Acts, there is a particular proximate reason why Luke, under inspiration, but also with Paul's suggestion, writes Luke and Acts as a 2-volume set. He writes these 2 volumes, and each one would have fit on one scroll. One is about what Jesus began to do and to teach, and that's actually the way Luke describes the gospel in Acts chapter 1. And then the other is about stuff that's after that. And it actually fits if you go through Acts and Luke and read it as if you're a Roman official, maybe Nero himself, but probably an underling, and say, okay, what's Christianity all about from this Roman point of view? So you start with John the Baptist. John the Baptist has tax collectors and soldiers come up. Do you remember soldiers asked him questions? And John the Baptist says, be content with your wages. Okay, for the tax collectors, don't collect more than you're supposed to. And every single Roman official that they ever interact with in Luke's gospel or in the book of Acts is somebody who either says this guy is innocent, in the case of like Pilate about Jesus, or the centurion at the foot of the cross, or an official like Gallio at Corinth in Acts chapter 18, who says, this isn't my jurisdiction, this is an internal Jewish matter. And systematically goes through that in cases, in places where the other Gospels have some of the same stories about Jesus' life and don't mention it. So, for example, Matthew, Mark, Luke all have the centurion at the foot of the cross, and all of them, when Jesus dies and there's things that happen, all say, wow, this is the Son of God. But it's only in Luke's record that he also says, oh, this man was innocent. And it's a systematic thing. And my point is, I have a couple points. One is, I think with Luke and Acts, there was a particular reason why it made sense to write Luke and Acts at that time, okay? Whereas before, there hadn't really been kind of a trigger to get it written. Sometimes if you're going to write something down, you almost need a trigger to, okay, you know what, it's time to put this down on paper type of a thing. Now, I want you to think about something. So I'm going to draw a map, and it's going to be freehand, so it's going to be bad, but it's meant to be conceptual, right? I want you to picture the Mediterranean world. So here's kind of north. Africa. So here's kind of North Africa, okay, down Egypt. Here it comes up, so here's Israel, so Jerusalem's over here, okay? It kind of loops around, and up here you have what we would think of as Turkey. This is the Anatolian Peninsula. It kind of pinches down here, and this peninsula is basically Greece. So here's the Aegean Sea. You've got the big island of Cyprus, the big island of Crete, a whole bunch of islands in the Aegean. And then over here, and don't ask me to draw it properly, but you have the boot of Italy, right? Okay. And you have Sicily over here, the little itty-bitty island of Malta. So pardon the crudeness of the map, but my point is a couple things. Number one, when you think about where Paul had ever done his ministry, okay, the headquarters for Paul's missionary journeys was Antioch of Syria, okay? And the first journey is real simple. So the first journey, he goes to Cyprus, goes up here to Galatia, and goes back. The second missionary journey, he goes up this way, visits Galatia again, goes up here, comes to Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, Athens, spends 18 months in Corinth, and then goes back. I won't draw the going back part. The third journey, basically he goes to Ephesus, spends 3 years in Ephesus. At the very end of the 3 years in Ephesus, he does a quick trip around here because he wants to visit, take up a collection for those in Jerusalem. He kind of loops back around and swings back up to Jerusalem. But then he was going to spend the winter in Crete, ends up on the shipwreck in Malta, finally makes his way up to Rome. So if you picture that, and here's Paul in Rome for 2 years, who's Luke going to address this to in terms of the Christians? The bulk of them are over here. They're the ones that Paul had preached to, and that's where he had founded all of these churches. And so Luke and Acts is partly written to the Roman officials. It's partly written to all the Christians primarily in this area so that they have a written record from the guy who's really taught them the gospel about stuff. It turns out, so Luke and Acts is written primarily to Christians here, and I think that when he does that, Matthew and Mark say, okay, you know what? Matthew says, I'm going to write a gospel that's more for the Christians that are over here. What are the Christians over here like? These are largely Gentile, but some Jews. The ones over here, they live in the land, so they don't need explanations about things. So, for example, in Acts 1, so that's written by Luke, it talks about Jesus ascending from the Mount of Olives, and it says in parentheses, the Mount of Olives is about a Sabbath day's journey from Jerusalem. You wouldn't say that to people who live there, because they know that, okay? So Matthew is written more to Christians here who are primarily Jewish, and so his focus is on Jesus as the King of the Jews and trying to prove to Jews that Jesus is the Messiah. Luke has a different focus as he's telling stories about it, about Jesus and then the subsequent stuff. Mark writes largely with Peter's help, and there's little technical details that seem to indicate that he addressed it primarily to the Christians who were in Italy at that time. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke all wrote their Gospels around 62 AD or thereabouts. I kind of think that Luke was first because he had a reason to with the hearing before Nero coming up, and Matthew and Mark wrote pretty much just after, but it doesn't matter if the order is slightly different or if they kind of said, it's time to get some stuff written, and they sort of divvied it up a little bit. But that's why we have three different accounts, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They're trying to tell different stories to different groups of people with different backgrounds. So often I think when we go to the Gospels, okay, we have a gospel story. So somebody give me a sample gospel story, doesn't matter what it is. Ray, you're not shy, so pick something.
The Pearl of Great Price.
The Pearl of Great Price. Okay, that's one of the parables, and it's in Matthew 13. Okay, Matthew, the way he's got it structured, Matthew does a lot of the teaching stuff. Because for the Jews, they looked at the Messiah as going to be a rabbi who would be a great teacher. So it's not that there aren't parables in Mark and Luke. John actually has no parables, but the parable of great price is in one of those teaching sections of Matthew, and that kind of makes sense. Okay, if you were to go through these make sense. And a lot of times when it's in more than one gospel, the reason for the difference is not just random. Okay, So I kind of wish I had more time. The only thing I want to say about Luke and Acts as a 2-volume set, though, is one other thing. There's something really neat about understanding Luke's gospel if you understand Acts first. If you understand Acts, one of the things you realize is that Paul went on these missionary journeys, and when he came to Ephesus on the 3rd missionary journey, he's there for 3 years, and then he wants to go to Jerusalem. First, he's going to swing around, he's got to take up a contribution. But if you read this section of Acts, it's around Acts 20 or so, he is intent on getting back to Jerusalem. He has several different reasons. He is absolutely dead set on going to Jerusalem. And if you remember, this is around Acts 20 and Acts 21. When he's on his way back, he meets up with people who keep telling him, do you know what's going to happen to you when you get to Jerusalem? So there was a prophet named Agabus who took Paul's own belt and bound his hands with his own belt. Paul, can I see your belt for a second? And then he binds his hand with his own belt. This was a symbol of what's going to happen to you when you go to Jerusalem. And Paul was absolutely intent on going to Jerusalem. He had several different reasons. It turns out that the way Luke has structured his gospel and the book of Acts, if you turn to Luke chapter 9, there's kind of a pivotal verse. And it's Luke 9 and verse 51. Louis or Jennifer, one of you want to read that in Luke 9 and verse 51, please?
When the days were approaching for his ascension, he was determined to go to Jerusalem.
Okay. And if you're ever trying to study the geography of Jesus' ministry and you're in Luke, once you get to Luke 9:51, the only thing that's important is he's heading for Jerusalem. And even though you can reconstruct from the other Gospels that he went here, and then he came down here, and came down here, as far as Luke's concerned, Jesus was intent on getting to Jerusalem. Okay? Tonight, I drove over here to Urbana. You don't want to know about all the stops I made. Not that I made a bunch of stops, but you don't need to know if I stopped for gas or whatever on the way. You know, what matters is I was on my way to Urbana. And in Luke's presentation, okay, Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem. And it turns out that Paul, in many ways, is following in the footsteps of Jesus in the way that Luke has constructed it. And one of the last things before we kind of move on from the Gospels is this. When you think about Jesus, who's the forerunner to Jesus in the Gospels? This is not a trick question. Who's his forerunner? It's John the Baptist. Now, what's John the Baptist's role? What's his job?
To baptize Jesus.
Okay, that's part of it.
That's part of it.
Mm-hmm.
And to bring the word, bring the knowledge that there is someone coming.
Okay.
Yes.
In total, he's there to prepare the people for the coming of the Lord, right?
Yes.
Let me ask a question. What is Paul the Apostle's job? It's the same thing. It's just on the other side of the timeline. It's like, here's Jesus on a timeline, and John the Baptist says, hey, everybody, get ready for the coming of Jesus. And what's Paul doing? He's doing the same basic thing that John the Baptist does. It's just afterwards, and he's preparing the people for the way of the Lord.
One thing I found fascinating is if you look at Genesis and John,
Yes,
they start the same way.
in the beginning.
Yeah.
And there's other connections. So I am going to look, speaking of that, I'm going to look at John next week. John is probably written about 20 years later, and you'll see why I want to cover it next week. So let me sort of leave the Gospels at that, but I do want to sort of leave this kind of conceptual picture of Paul's journeys up here, because the other thing we're going to look at tonight is Paul's epistles. So the first of Paul's epistles that is listed in the normal Bible table of contents is Romans. So if you think about the normal table of contents, it's like Romans and 1st and 2nd Corinthians and so on. And it turns out that what I'd much prefer to do is think of Paul's epistles in the order in which they were written, because that gives us a context for understanding what each epistle about, why it was written, and what the main themes are. So for me, the way I kind of picture this is I sort of break it down into Paul's 1st, 2nd, and 3rd missionary journeys, then his imprisonment, and then after the imprisonment, I'll just put post-prison. And then try to picture Paul's epistles in each of these. So the first journey, he starts in Antioch, which was his base. He goes to the island of Cyprus. This is in chapter 13. He comes up to Pisidian Antioch, also in 13. And then he comes to a series of cities, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. And that Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe, that's all part of the region of Galatia. So he gets these churches started in the region of Galatia. In Lystra, by the way, is where he was stoned. He was taken out of the city for dead, okay, but then he's up the next day. And he then returns and so on. That's Acts chapter 14, where this all happens, where he's stoned at Iconium, or where he's stoned at Lystra, but he's in Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. That's Acts chapter 14. Come to the end of Acts 14, and we see what happens at the end of the first missionary journey. Dana, are you able to read there?
Yep.
If you would, the last three verses of Acts 14, so verses 26 through 28, please.
And from there they sailed to Antioch, from which they had been commended to the grace of God for the work that they had accomplished. And when they had arrived and gathered the church together, they began to report all things that God had done with them, and how he had opened a door of faith to the Gentiles. And they spent a long time with the disciples.
Okay, so they finished, they come back, they give the report, and among other things, we preach to a lot of Gentiles. Ray, would you read the next verse? So the first verse of chapter 15, please.
Some men came down from Judea and began teaching the brethren, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved.
Okay, so some heard about this, and they were very upset with the theology that Gentiles couldn't come in without taking up all the customs and following the law of Moses. So some of them go up to Galatia and start troubling these brand new believers up there. This was an internal Christian theological problem, and so that prompts two things. The rest of Acts chapter 15 is largely about what's often called the Jerusalem Council, where Acts 15 verse 6, the apostles and others came together in Jerusalem to look into this matter, and they have this big discussion, meeting about it. But in the meantime, at about the same time, this is the background to Paul writing. So it's kind of right at the end of the first journey and before the second journey begins, Paul writes Galatians. And so his reason for writing is he's going to say, Dear Galatians, I can't believe you are so quickly falling away from the truth that I just taught you. Okay? In Galatians 2, he talks about false brethren who've come in and they're trying to steal our liberty. And so he has a particular problem in that region of Galatia with these people teaching this false gospel message about you need, as Christians, to keep the law of Moses and the customs of Moses, otherwise you cannot be saved. And so that's the background to Galatians, and that's why he writes what he does. So he begins the second missionary journey. The second missionary journey, I want to pick up one quick fact that we'll come back to later. In Acts chapter 16, starting with verse 1, is when Paul begins the second missionary journey. In Acts 16, starting with verse 1, says, Paul came also to Derbe and to Lystra. So he's coming to Derbe and Lystra as he's visiting them again. And there was a disciple there named Timothy. Now we're going to see a lot about Timothy later. But this is where they have this disciple named Timothy, who's the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was a Greek. And he was well spoken of by the brethren who were in Lystra and Iconium. And he takes Timothy, who's probably about 16 or 18 years old, and takes him with himself and Silas. And so it's Paul, Silas, and Timothy who go to Troas. They go to Philippi, where he ends up in prison, and he's singing at midnight, and there's an earthquake. He goes to Thessalonica. This is in Acts chapter 17. In Thessalonica, he gets run out of town by the Jewish leaders within about a month. So he goes, Paul, along with Silas and Timothy, he preaches to those in Thessalonica, gets a very good reception, some Jews, some Gentiles, but very quickly the Jewish leaders get jealous, and they're so persecutorial, is that a word, that they run Paul out of town. He goes down to Berea, and these guys are so bad that when Paul flees to Berea, the Jewish leaders follow him down there, and then they run him out of Berea. And so Paul ends up in Athens. And while he's in Athens, waiting for Silas and Timothy to sort of catch up, as it were, that's when he gives his speech at Athens. Okay, he's there for a little bit. He sees this altar with the dedication to the unknown God, gives the great speech at the end of Acts chapter 17. He ends up down in Corinth, Silas and Timothy come down to Corinth as well. But it's just after he's founded the church at Thessalonica, and he goes down to Athens and then Corinth, that he writes on the second missionary journey, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians.
This is on the second,
On the second missionary journey.
yeah, okay.
And so the time in Thessalonica is Acts chapter 17. If you want the verses, it's verses 1 through 9. Because 17 verse 10, they send Paul and Silas down to Berea. So he's only been in Thessalonica for a month. Brand new church. He's been run out of town, basically. And very quickly he writes 1 Thessalonians, and shortly after that he writes 2 Thessalonians. So again, he's putting out some fires to some very new believers. But this is a different set of fires than Galatians. Galatians was more of a Christian internal theology debate. Okay? 1 and 2 Thessalonians, this is persecution from Jews. This is not an internal theological debate in anything like the same way. This is more jealousy from the Jewish leaders of Thessalonica. So that was written kind of between the 1st and 2nd missionary journeys. 1st and 2nd Thessalonians written during the 2nd missionary journey. He goes to Corinth, he spends 18 months, he works his way back. Okay. The 3rd journey basically is 3 years in Ephesus. So the bulk of the time on the 3rd missionary journey, which is about 3.5 years, he spends in Ephesus. As he's finishing up the 3 years in Ephesus, his plan is to go around and stop at each of these cities, and he wants to take up a collection for the brothers and sisters around Jerusalem who become quite poor because of some particular things that were happening in Jerusalem at that time. So he wants to go around, and he's had them take up a collection of money in advance so that when he gets there, he can pick up the collection, pick it up, pick it up, pick it up. Now he's going to plan on having some bundle of money that he can bring back to Jerusalem. He wants to visit them, pick up this collection, and then he wants to head back. That's the plan. So as he's wrapping up in Ephesus, okay, he's going to write 1 Corinthians. I'm leaving a gap. Since you're also smart, you know I'm going to, well, I'll go ahead right now. So 2 Corinthians is going to be written shortly thereafter. But what he does is he has 2 proximate reasons for writing to Corinth just before he goes to visit them. The 2 proximate reasons are, number 1, he's heard that they've had a lot of problems, okay? There's a problem with some of the brothers and sisters suing each other in the Roman courts because of some of the problems they have. There's a particular case of the guy who's sleeping with his stepmother, okay? Immorality such as he is abominable even among the Gentiles, okay? They have divisions and there's jealousy and strife among them. So there's a host of problems that have been reported to Paul that he's heard about. Remember, he had spent 18 months there. He knew them quite well, but he's heard that they've had a number of problems. The other thing is, it's evident that they had written a letter, and they had written a letter and they had a series of questions. So they said, Paul, what are your thoughts about marriage? Paul, what are your thoughts about eating food that's been sold in markets where it first gets offered to idols? Paul, we have some questions about the resurrection. So 1 Corinthians basically has 2 things he's doing. One is addressing some of the problems, just internal, so it's a different kind of fire than he's had to deal with here. And he's also responding to some of the legitimate questions that they have about different things. And he ties it all together with one of the most well-known and well-loved chapters in the Bible, 1 Corinthians 13, about love. So am I the only one who has 1 Corinthians 13 on a big thing in my living room? Anybody else have something with the quote, 1 Corinthians 13? You do? Okay.
Yeah, I have it in little notepads.
Okay.
And I'm going to frame one of them before I use them all.
Okay. Well, my wife's made sure we framed ours in the living room, but that's not uncommon, because 1 Corinthians 13, the chapter about love, is like the one unifying answer to all these disparate issues that he's dealing with. 2 Corinthians is a quick follow-up. So as he's working his way around to get to Corinth, where he's going to end up spending the winter, as he's working his way around, he hears about how they've responded to the first epistle. And so right before he gets there, he writes the second epistle. It sort of follows up, and including about the issue of the contribution. So 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9, some really good thoughts about taking up the collection of money for the brothers and sisters in Jerusalem. Okay. He comes to Corinth. He spends 3 months in Corinth. If you want the reference, it's Acts 20 and verse 3. Acts 20, verse 3 is where it says he spent 3 months there. And it's while he's in Corinth for those 3 months, Acts 20, verse 3, that he writes Romans. So what's his reason for writing Romans? He hasn't been to Rome. It's not one of the churches he founded. There's not people troubling or persecution or anything like the same way. It's not a church he founded where they've got questions. Here's his plan at this point. His plan is to spend the winter in Corinth. And part of the reason is just travel was so difficult during the winter, so he's waiting till the weather gets better in the spring. He'll get to Jerusalem, he'll drop that off. But his plan is, from here, he wants to go to Jerusalem, and then he wants to go to Spain. I didn't draw Spain on the map, but he wants to stop by Rome on the way to Spain. And so he has occasion to write Romans. And the nice thing about Romans in some ways, he's not putting out a fire. It's not some temporary issue or some big problem. And so what he does when he writes to the Romans is he does say, I'm planning to go to Jerusalem and I want to go to Spain, but I'm going to stop and meet you guys first. They were a very important church for no other reason than it's the capital of the empire. And you've got a lot of people who are influential and have a lot of connections and so on. But what he does in Romans is he writes something of a kind of a systematic theological treatise. And that treatise is a nice thing where he's not dealing with the problem of the moment and responding to that issue. And it's set out as a nice theological treatise. So if you ever need kind of one book, and so this isn't fair to single Romans out, but this is the best book available. If you ever want to find just one book in the Bible that's going to do the best job of summarizing the whole Bible, I would argue it's probably Romans, because he takes so much of the Old Testament and he digests it down, okay, and says, here's what the Scripture is all about. And so I'm not going to try to do a digest version of Romans here and sort of further digest it down, but that's really what Romans is. It's a theological treatise where he's not really putting out whatever the latest fire is. So it really deserves kind of the, maybe prestige isn't the right word, but the level of importance that we give to Romans. It's really a fundamentally important book because it's not just putting out this fire or that fire. It's really kind of tying things together. So Romans, you can pencil in Romans next to Acts 20, verse 3 in your Bible, because it was during that 3 months he was in Corinth that it was written. And there's indications of that, including at the end of Romans in chapter 16. So anyway, he finishes the 3 months. He works his way back to Jerusalem. Okay, there's the riot in chapter 21, and then I mentioned these already. He ends up giving his defense before the crowd, and then before the Sanhedrin, and then before Felix. And he's kept for 2 years in Caesarea. At the end of the 2 years, when Festus comes in, he appeals to Caesar, and Agrippa shows up a couple of days later. He gives the defense before Agrippa as well, and Agrippa says, are you trying to persuade me to be a Christian, like I already mentioned? And then he ends up taking the shipwreck, and all the stuff about the shipwreck. He ends up on Malta. And again, so he'd spent the previous winter in Corinth on purpose. He's here for a couple of years, and then he's here for 3 months at the start of winter when they got into the storm and ended up on Malta. So in the spring, he ends up in Rome, and he waits in Rome for 2 years. Okay? But he's in prison in Rome for 2 years. That's those last couple of verses of Acts 28. And it's while he's there that he writes a total of 4 epistles in kind of 2 sets. The first set is Ephesians, Colossians, and Philemon. So if you're so inclined to mark your Bibles, those 3 are written all at the same time in the period of Acts 28 and verse 30. 28 and verse 30 was one of those verses that Alaric had read about. He stayed 2 full years in his own rented quarters, and it's probably in the middle of that 2 years that he writes Ephesians, Colossians, and Philemon. So what's going on here?
Did you say 3 years?
He was there for 2 years.
2 years.
That's Acts 28 and verse 30. and it's probably in the middle of the 2 years, or about in the middle, when he writes these three.
And it's about what?
The end of Acts.
That's when he writes these three epistles kind of all at the same time,
At the end of Acts. Okay.
at the end of Acts, yeah.
Okay.
Now, let me mention something before we go further here. Turn over to Revelation, and I want to show you something in Revelation, okay? In chapters 2 and 3, we have 7 different cities to whom the book of Revelation is addressed, okay? Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. And on my kind of crude map here, I've written them like that because that's basically how they are geographically. And the point of this is Revelation 2 verse 1 says, to the angel of the church in Ephesus write. And then a few verses later, to the angel of the church of Smyrna, and so on. And the idea of Revelation, and we'll talk about Revelation next week, is it was addressed in such a way that the original copy went to the church at Ephesus first. They were supposed to look at it. Once they were done, you give it to the next one, which is Smyrna. And after they're done, it works its way around until it gets to Laodicea. Laodicea is the last of these 7, and the Laodicea section starts in Revelation 3, verse 14. So it ends to the angel of the church in Laodicea, right? And here's the particulars for Laodicea. Now, Laodicea is right here, and the city next door to it is Colossae, and they're called Colossians. If you turn over to Colossians chapter 4,
What was the Revelation passage?
Laodicea is mentioned in Revelation 3 and verse 14.
You said Colossians 4.
Colossians 4, and Alaric, would you read? I've got you reading like the end of each book, it seems like. Colossians 4, read verse 16.
Okay. And when this letter has been written among you, have it read also in the church of the Laodiceans, and see that you read also the letter from Laodicea.
Okay. So as he's writing Colossians, he finishes with some greetings. So he mentions greetings to different people and updates them on and so on. So like, for example, verse 14, Luke, the beloved physician, sends you his greetings and so on. But anyway, so he's writing to brothers and sisters in Colossae and says, when you finish this letter, trade it with the letter to the Laodiceans. So where's the epistle to the Laodiceans? We don't have one. We've got Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Galatians, and so on, to the Laodiceans. Here's the thing about this. Ephesians is probably what it's referring to. Okay? The epistle to the Ephesians was written at the same time from the same place while he was in prison for 2 years. That was sent to Ephesus, but it was intended as a circular letter to the same 7 churches that are mentioned in Revelation chapters 2 and 3. So it would have circled around and then trade that, you two, Laodicea and Colossae. If you look at Ephesians and Colossians, they're very similar. It has the same kinds of topics, some very slight differences. One quick illustration of that, so we don't have time for anything like a full proof of it, as it were. But if you look at Ephesians and Colossians and start to notice all the cross-references, one of the things you find is that both Ephesians and Colossians have a section where it talks about how people should be related to each other. So husbands, here's how you should treat your wives. Wives, here's how you should treat your husbands. So you got the husband-wife relationship. And then there's a thing that says parents, here's how you should treat your kids. Kids, here's how you should obey your parents. And then the third section is masters, here's how you should treat your servants. Servants, here's how you should treat your masters. And it's practically the same in both Ephesians and Colossians. Right.
Why didn't he just tack Colossians onto the end of that circular letter?
Good question, because you've got your thinking cap on.
So you're saying, I just want to get it straight, you're saying that the letter to the Laodiceans might be Ephesians.
Yes. And one thing let me just mention this briefly, and I don't want to get too bogged down. Turn over to Ephesians 1 and look at verse 1. Pat, would you mind reading Ephesians 1, verse 1?
Okay. Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus by the will of God, to the saints who are at Ephesus and who are faithful in Christ Jesus.
Okay.
Great. Oh,
Yeah, that's good, just through verse 1. So it's addressed to who? To the saints who are at Ephesus. Or, I'm not even sure which one. I've always pronounced it Ephesus, so that's what we're using. Okay. But does anybody have a version where at Ephesus is not in your Bible?
The footnote says 3 early manuscripts do not contain at Ephesus.
Right. So if we were to go more technical into this, here's what happens. If you look at all the ancient Greek manuscripts, among the oldest ones, all it says is Paul to the saints who are faithful in God, and it doesn't have something there. And it seems like some scribe added it at Ephesus, but it was probably either to Ephesus with the understanding it was to these 7, or just to the saints, it was dropped off. But that still leaves kind of your question, why 2 that are so similar at the same time, especially if you're going to trade them? Well, the other one that's written at the same time is Philemon. Okay? Philemon is the name of a person. So, first you got to find Philemon. It's right before Hebrews. It's one of those books that's so small and so rarely used. Okay. Philemon is about Philemon, I should say, the person, is a master, so he has slaves. And again, lots of people had slaves, and slavery back then was very different than like the modern slavery that we've had in more modern centuries and so on. Philemon is a wealthy Christian who has slaves who lives in Colossae. Onesimus is one of those slaves. Okay? And it seems like when you read this, it's pretty clear that Paul, when he had done his preaching work, is the one who had taught Philemon, living in Colossae, about the gospel. And so Philemon was baptized because he heard the preaching of Paul. Onesimus was a slave who ran away. What's the penalty for a slave running away in the Roman Empire? And if you don't know, you can guess and you're going to be right. It's death. And what's the penalty if you run away and you steal on your way out? You're permanently dead, right? Okay. Well, we're not told the circumstances, but Onesimus, when he fled, managed to get all the way to Rome and meets up with Paul while Paul's in prison. And it seems like there he kind of went to Paul, and we're kind of having to read between the lines here, but it seems like he's come to Paul, okay, and has kind of come to his senses, and again, I'm reading between the lines here, but it seems like he's come to Paul and said, Paul, you taught the truth, you taught the gospel to my master, and I did something as stupid as all get out, and I stole as I left, and now I've got a death sentence, and now what do I do? But I want to learn the gospel and so on. So if you look at Philemon verse 10, Paul writes to Philemon, I appeal to you for my child Onesimus, whom I have begotten in my imprisonment. In other words, he baptized Philemon while he was there in prison in Rome. Well, Paul was in prison in Rome, but now he's sending him back. Verse 12, I have sent him back to you in person. Okay? And now he's still your slave, but he's also a Christian brother. And that's a curious relationship. Imagine you're a Christian who has slaves, and the slave who ran away and who stole from you on the way out is now your brother in Christ. That's an awkward relationship. But Paul is appealing to him, and it seems like what he's doing, and so this kind of goes back to the question, instead of saying, by the way, you're maybe not one of these 7 cities that's a little more prominent and so on, it seems like Colossians gets its own slightly different version of the letter, along with the letter to Philemon. So when the way this is delivered is Philemon goes back with, I think it's, I'd have to get the name, I'd have to look it up. It's going to be at the end of Colossians. So let me look that up later. I'm stuck for the name, but whoever it is that would have hand-delivered this back, probably the way it was delivered is whoever it is that leaves along with Onesimus. They go back, they drop the first letter off in Ephesus. They then go to Colossae. The first letter is working its way around. The second epistle, very much like the first, is this one that we call Colossians. A lot of the same themes. slightly different, slightly nuanced, but at the end trade it, and that way you can kind of see what the other's written. Along with this letter to the person Philemon, please receive Onesimus. So it seems like that's one reason why. And I think in the big picture, the one reason it does this is, I think so often, so here's the thing, when you look at Ephesians and Colossians, they really are so similar in so many ways. And I think that what happens is sometimes we read an epistle and we can get too energetic and too dogmatic about the way we look at certain things. And this is actually a good exercise to go through one of these. And if you think you've got a passage in Ephesians figured out, go find the cross-reference in Colossians, because I assure you there's a cross-reference in Colossians, and see if it still makes sense. Or you could start with Colossians and then cross-reference it to Ephesians. And it actually kind of teaches us to be a little humble about our Bible study and not be so quick to be so dogmatic. But you really can't look at Ephesians without spending half your time in Colossians and vice versa. It really is very similar. I'm going to leave Ephesians, Colossians, and Philemon there. Okay? And then he writes one more, probably towards the end of the same 2 years that he's in prison in Rome that's mentioned in Acts 28, and that's Philippians. He's still in prison, and we already touched on this when he was talking to Agrippa. What do you think Paul was spending his time doing while he's in prison? He's trying to convert everybody he can, right? One of the things that he writes to the Philippians, when he writes to them, so here's Philippi, he's writing a letter to the Philippians. He's got some particular reasons. But one of the things he says in chapter 1 is, my imprisonment has turned out for good. And a whole bunch of the Praetorian Guard, some of the Roman soldiers that would have been guarding him in his own rented house, a lot of the Praetorian Guard had become Christian. I think it's wonderfully ironic that he writes to the Philippians. If you want the verse for it, it's Philippians 1. I'm good at chapters. I always have to look it up for the verse. I shouldn't say always, but Philippians 1. 13. So 12 and 13, I want you to know, brethren, my circumstances have turned out for the greater progress of the gospel, so that my imprisonment has become well known throughout the whole Praetorian Guard and to everyone else, and that most of the brethren, trusting the Lord because of my imprisonment, have far more courage to speak the word of God without fear. What's ironic is about him writing to the Philippians and saying, my imprisonment has turned out for good. And what's ironic is what happened to him when he was at Philippi in Acts chapter 16. His imprisonment there turned out for good. He and Silas got beaten. They were had their feet in the stocks. And what were they doing at midnight? They're singing hymns, praising, praying, and there's an earthquake, and the Philippian jailer is going to commit suicide because he thinks he's in trouble for what he assumes is the prisoners all running off. And Paul says, no. And so the Philippian jailer and his household get baptized that night. So Philippian church got started because Paul's imprisonment in Philippi was for good. And so here, his imprisonment in Rome turns out for good. And he's saying, dear Philippians, my imprisonment here has turned out for good too. And then he gives some other exhortations. So it's not just about that. He's not just sharing some good news.
I'm sort of wondering, what's their connection of that when... I'm going to say Christmas song. I don't know if it really is a Christmas song, where Paul and Silas are on number 2. And then one was the Hebrew baby.
You might have me stumped on that one. I can't think of a Christmas song that has to do with Philippians per se.
No, it's Paul and Silas.
Okay. But they're singing it in Acts chapter 16.
2 for Paul and Silas, one for the itty bitty baby. Born in Bethlehem.
You're right, there is a lyric to something like that. We'll have to listen to it this season and see if we can figure out which one.
You can sing it for us next week, Howard.
Okay.
So he then was released from prison. So this is where presumably what we would have if we had an Acts 29. He gives his defense before Nero, and he is released. He did not convert Nero. Okay, we know that. And he's released for a couple of years. We're not told of anything like the book of Acts, but later it turns out he's arrested again, and he's brought and he's going to die in prison. But by post-prison, I mean after the first imprisonment. And he's going to write Titus and 1 Timothy. So now we're past the book of Acts. So after Paul's been released, he starts working again. And one of the things he does is he leaves Titus on Crete. So Titus, the person, is on the island of Crete. Timothy has been left at Ephesus. And Timothy and Titus, these two guys who were both probably about 30 or so, Paul is writing to them very similar epistles. So Titus and 1 Timothy are very similar. In both of them, Paul basically says, Dear Timothy or Dear Titus, here's how I want you to organize the churches where you are. Timothy, you're in Ephesus. Here's what I want you to do in Ephesus. Titus, you're in Crete. And there's some particular things about Crete, for example. But in both of those, they're very similar. Again, kind of like Ephesians and Colossians, very similar. Titus and 1 Timothy are very similar, saying here's how you should organize the churches. Now, there's some other exhortations as well, but that's kind of the approximate reason for writing. And that brings us to the last of Paul's epistles. He was working for a while. He had left Timothy at Ephesus, left Titus at Crete. He ends up imprisoned again. And by this time, if you ever look at Nero, I don't know how much everybody knows about Nero, but one of the things that you might recall is the Great Fire in Rome, and they talk about how he fiddled while Rome burned, and that's probably apocryphal. If memory serves, I believe he was in Greece when the fire happened. And anyway, but Nero, the last couple of years of his life, he went just berserk and kind of off the deep end, and just turned into an absolute monster of a person. And so unlike that first imprisonment where Paul got what appears to have been some kind of a relatively fair hearing, even though we don't have it in what would be Acts 29, and Nero evidently released him. When he comes back the second time, there's no doubt he's going to die. And so it's at the very end of his life, and he knows he's going to die at the end of this. That's the background to 2 Timothy. So in 2 Timothy, if you come to chapter 4, it's a very different tone of voice. He's not fatalistic, he's not suicidal or anything like that, but he understands he's at the end of his life. So in 2 Timothy 4, he's going to pass the baton, so to speak, of leadership on to Timothy, that young man he picked up in Galatia at the beginning of the second missionary journey. And as he's passing on the baton of leadership in some regards to Timothy, kind of like Moses had done to Joshua, or Elijah had done to Elisha, or something like that. Okay. He's going to write 2 Timothy 4, okay, these words. You'll recognize these words from about verse 6. Jennifer, do you mind reading 2 Timothy 4, verses 6 through 8, please?
For I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the course. I have kept the faith. In the future there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will reward me on that day, and not only me, but also to all who have loved his appearing.
Okay, so he understands he's basically at the end of his life, and so he's, okay, I fought the good fight, I finished the course, I've kept the faith. So, Ray, you and I were talking earlier, you didn't make it over to the Indy Marathon because you had a prior commitment last week, but had you done it, as you were closing in the last quarter mile of the run, and assuming you weren't just about at death's doorstep, you would have been looking at the finish line coming up and said, I've run the race, even though you haven't quite finished it, perhaps, right? That's in effect what Paul's saying here. He knows he's nearing the end of his life, and he's going to die at the end of this. So it's a different attitude. But I like the confidence. It's not boasting. It's not hubris. He's not cocky here. But there is a confidence that he can have that he didn't have when he had written Philippians earlier. In Philippians 3, he talks about, I press on toward the goal, not having attained, okay? It's as if at some level in Philippians 3, he knows, okay, I haven't lived my whole life yet, but here he knows he's at the end of his life. And there's a role, without boasting, where you can be confident about God and the possibility of that crown of righteousness being awarded. And Paul was a person who, in his particular case, I think, could have a confidence without boasting about that kind of thing. And so as he finishes in 2 Timothy, this last epistle of Timothy, he's at the end of his life. He's got a couple of things to sort of wrap up. And if you remember, in the first week of the class, we looked at verse 13. Verse 13 says, when you come, bring the cloak which I left at Troas with Carpus and the books, especially the parchments. And do you remember I used this verse to point out a couple things? One is, like every commentary I've ever read says, oh, this is a picture of Paul. He's in that prison cell. It's cold. He's freezing. And so in verse 9, he says, make effort to come soon. In verse 21, make every effort to come before winter. And every commentary I've ever read also says, oh, here's a picture of Paul. He's shivering. He knows he's going to die. He just wants a coat. And I pointed out in the first week 2 things. Number 1, no, he's not asking for it for warmth, because he could have asked Luke for a coat. He wants something about that cloak. And then my other point was I wanted to be dogmatic, saying he didn't want it for warmth, but I wasn't dogmatic about what he did want it for. And I think it was, so this is just a reminder of what I said the first week. I think he wanted that particular coat that he had left at Troas with Carpus. He wants Timothy to come so that he can give it right back to Timothy as kind of a symbol of passing on the mantle of leadership, as it were. But this week, what I want to focus on is the last half of the verse. And the books, especially the parchments. If he didn't want a coat for warmth, I submit he didn't want books because he was bored. He's not writing Timothy saying, I'm really bored sitting here in prison with nothing to do, and the TV set hasn't been working because they won't fix it. I'm bored, please bring a book. What did he want? Especially because he doesn't just want books, he wants the books, especially the parchments. And I have a very particular suggestion about what he wanted. Again, like the thing with the particular coat, I'm not dogmatic about this, but I do think pretty strongly about this. Here's what I think he wanted. He's at the end of his life. It's probably about the year 65. Okay, he's getting ready to die. Galatians was probably written around 49, maybe 50. Okay, we can attach dates to these other things later. So he's been writing different epistles over the course of 15 years. He wrote one that went to Galatia, to a couple of Thessalonica, a couple of Corinth, one to Rome, where he's at now. Ephesians, which is probably circular, Colossians and Philemon, both in Colossae, Philippi up here. Here's one in Crete. 1st and 2nd Timothy both probably go to Timothy when he's at Ephesus. Think about how those epistles that he wrote over the course of 15 years to all these different churches came to be in our Bible. I think what he's asking Timothy is this. When you come, verse 13, bring that coat, okay, but also bring the copies of the epistles, and if you can, especially the original copies. I think that's what he means by especially the parchments. So if you can, round up the epistles that I sent to Galatia, Philippi, Corinth, Thessalonica, the 2 to you, plus Ephesus, and whether or not that's circular, the 2 that go to Colossae, 1 via Philemon, to Titus on Crete, and bring those so that there's a collection of the inspired scriptures that are written over the course of these years. And that makes sense on a couple different levels, including, if you skip forward to 2 Peter, because 2 Peter's written just a little bit after Paul wrote 2 Timothy. 2 Peter 3, and Dana, would you read verses 14 through 16? So 2 Peter 3, 14 through 16, and we're just about done for tonight here.
Therefore, beloved, since you look for these things, be diligent to be found by him in peace, spotless and blameless, and regard the patience of our Lord to be salvation, just as also our beloved brother Paul, according to the wisdom given him, wrote to you, as also in all his letters, speaking in them of these things, in which are some things hard to understand, which the untaught and unstable distort, as they do also the rest of the scriptures, to their own destruction.
Okay, so he's writing about things, it says, by the way, just as Paul has also written. And if you have your thinking cap on, there's a couple things that should really jump out about verse 16. One's got to put a smile on your face. He says there's some things that Paul has written that are hard to understand. And who's saying this? This is Peter. Peter says every once in a while Paul says something, and I even struggle myself a little bit. I love that puts a smile on my face for all the right reasons. But what's the other thing that really jumps out of the page in that verse 16? These people twist things just as they do the rest of the scriptures. Peter writing just after Paul's death, and he's probably writing from Rome, there's indications of that as well. He's saying, here's this collection of Paul's writings and its scriptures. He's recognizing them as scripture on a par with what we would call the Old Testament. And that's amazing. And I think that's probably because Timothy had gone around and collected these. And one quick thing we do not have time to explore. If anybody wants, I could kind of work through it later. Timothy is uniquely positioned because he's related to every single one of these epistles. 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, if you look at verse 1, it's Paul, Silvanus, and Timothy to the brothers and sisters in Thessalonica. He's related in 1st and 2nd Corinthians. I can work through it, but we won't do that. He's mentioned in Romans. In Ephesus, he's probably there. Okay, there's mentions of him in Colossians, which by implication is Philemon. There's a reference to him in Philippians. 2 Timothy is a no-brainer, which leaves Galatians as the outlier. And it actually leads to something else. Remember when we first met Timothy in Acts chapter 16 when Paul was starting his second missionary journey, and there was a young man who was well spoken of by the brethren. And that actually speaks to why was he well spoken of by the brethren? And this is just after Galatians was written. And here's what happens. When these would have been written to each church, or maybe a circular kind of a thing, something happened that we maybe don't think about. Most people weren't literate, and they didn't have multiple copies. So they couldn't say, okay, would you read verse, whatever. So how was each of these epistles received in the church? Somebody who was literate had to get up and have the copy and read it aloud to the congregation and explain it and defend it. I think that young Timothy, 16 or 17 years old, is the guy who did that to the churches in Galatia, and that's why he was well spoken of. So that a few months later, when Paul and Silas come up, they come to Galatia, and he's well spoken of. Hey, this young man, he's amazing. He was the one who read Galatians, your epistle to the churches of the region of Galatia, explained it to everybody, and that's why Paul and Silas say, why don't you come with us, Timothy?
Where is the well spoken of?
Acts 16, verse 1 or maybe verse 2. But it's right at the beginning of Acts 16. The well spoken of is actually verse 2, but it's kind of 16 verses 1 and 2.
And
So,
you said Timothy read these where?
So Timothy is from Lystra, which is one of the cities in the region of Galatia.
Okay.
Galatia is a region, and there's multiple cities, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. So, but anyway, so if you think about that 2 Peter 3, Peter's saying, so here's Paul's epistles. So we're going to finish up there this week. Next week, the plan is to do the remaining epistles, plus the writings of John, including Revelation and the Gospel of John. The very last thing I want to mention here, just to wrap up, you'll notice there's one epistle up here that is often called an epistle of Paul that isn't up here. And that's the epistle of Hebrews. So just to alleviate any confusion, because we will talk about Hebrews next week, a lot of people think that...
Oh, that's an epistle? I always thought it was just a letter.
An epistle is a letter. Just
Okay.
Yeah, it's a slightly technical version for a kind of letter, but an epistle is a letter. So the epistle to the Hebrews or the letter to the Hebrews, a lot of people think it's Paul. It never actually says that in the text, and there are several reasons to cast some serious doubt on that, including the collection that began to circulate in the early church of these 13 epistles did not include Hebrews. Hebrews wasn't thought of as a letter or epistle of Paul until later, and there's like little spelling differences in the Greek, and there's other indications it's probably not by Paul. So I'm not dogmatic saying it wasn't written by Paul. I think it probably wasn't. Even if it is, I just want to finish up with this. If Hebrews, which we're going to look at in a little bit of detail next week, if Hebrews is written by Paul, it's hard to put it on a timeline. It would probably be somewhere down here, but we're not sure. There's no way to know for sure, Pat.
So if you don't think Paul wrote it, who do you think wrote it?
I don't know. My best guess would be Apollos. We meet Apollos at the end of Acts 18. It says he was mighty and eloquent, well-versed in the scriptures. He powerfully refuted the Jews in public. He was a Jew from Alexandria. And I don't want to get technical because I get it over my head. Maybe I'll just leave you with this.
What about Barnabas?
Barnabas is another possibility.
After what you're saying, it possibly could be Timothy
too later.
That's what I was thinking.
It's possible.
That's why I thought you were leading.
According to some of the Greek scholars, this isn't what I had planned on talking about, but just very briefly, just so I don't leave you kind of hanging about some of this. A 2-liter pop. If I was going to write a 2-liter pop, I would write liter, L-I-T-E-R. How would somebody from Britain spell it? Okay, so if you're reading something in English and you see liter spelled like this, or meter, M-E-T-R-E, what do we deduce about the author? They're British, or I don't know, do Canadians spell it that way too? I think so, okay.
I think you do.
I think they do. But you probably think they're not American, right? If you knew the Greek, which I don't to this level, I'm told that when you look at some of the spellings in Greek, it's more like this, where all of those Paul's epistles would do it like this. And there are little technical things like that there's no way to capture in English that are little hints that it probably was not by Paul. It turns out with Hebrews it doesn't matter. We'll look at Hebrews next week. I didn't want to get too much into the weeds on Hebrews. I just wanted to point out, in case you were thinking that I was talking about Paul's epistles and we didn't get to Hebrews, we will get to it next week. And I don't think it's written by Paul, but I'm not dogmatic about it.
My thing just says, I have an introduction thing.
Yeah, in fact, so just reading it, it says the author of this letter does not identify himself, but he was obviously well known to the original recipients. For many years, Paul was considered to be the author, but since the Reformation, it has been widely recognized that Paul could not have been the author. And that's kind of scholars should look at some of these like spelling things and so on like that. So, any other questions for tonight? Again, like each of these weeks, we're doing a lot of stuff.
Somewhere it seems like recently I read that there might have been a third volume, Luke, Acts, and another that never got written. But, you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I've heard that a little bit. It's basically speculation, but it is because it ends so
Right.
like abruptly. I would say that there's absolutely no evidence at all that there was a third volume written that somehow got lost. There are some who think that maybe he was planning on writing a third volume,
Right, that's what I mean.
but didn't get around to it. Not like he just got bored with the topic, but like, death intervened or something. There's no real good evidence for that. It probably doesn't matter. One thing I didn't get into is if you start reading maybe some of the introductions, you'll find that there's more than just 2 epistles to the Corinthians. What we call 2 Corinthians is actually like the 3rd epistle. He actually wrote one in between, but it wasn't preserved by Timothy and so on. So, but yeah, I've heard that about, but there's no real evidence, and it doesn't.
Well, one thing I learned from this Bible that I've never known until I got a reference Bible that the book of Samuel is all one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we break it into 1st and 2nd.
Yeah.
But it was originally
And then
same with Kings, same with Chronicles.
And then there was another book that have like 2 separate names that were originally one. I think it was Ephesians.
Ezra and Nehemiah.
Oh yeah.
Ezra and Nehemiah if you have a copy of the Hebrew Scriptures, it's one book. We split it up into 2, and it doesn't really change the way we understand it.
Yeah.
Okay, so the plan is we're going to wrap up here. Next week, Lord willing, we'll start with Hebrews. And Hebrews, if you understand why it was written and to whom it was written, even if we're not sure who the author is, tells a wonderful, absolutely wonderful story that's just brilliant in so many ways. We're then going to look at the other epistles and then finish with the writings of John, including John's Gospel and Revelation.
One thing about Hebrews is I'm kind of amazed that it's in the New Testament, which is in Greek,
Okay.
and not the Old Testament, which was in Hebrew.
Mm-hmm. I'll address that next week.
Yeah.
So let's go ahead and close with prayer tonight. Thanks for letting me go a little long. So, our Heavenly Father, we thank you again for giving us your written scriptures. You've written to us through the wisdom of your apostles. They recorded things so that we would have records of these things, not as a way to pursue trivial historical matters, but as a way to understand that you've exhorted so many different people in so many different circumstances. You've exhorted the prophets and the Israelites through the prophets. You've exhorted so many of those early Christians, both Jew and Gentile, through your apostles. We have the records that have written about your Son and about the subsequent things. Help us to learn from all these things. Truly, they were written for our instruction. Please keep us safe, and we pray that you bring your kingdom soon. If not, please bring us safely again to this class next week. We ask that you hear this prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. Again, thank you for letting me go a little long.